Mokele-mbembe. The word sits in the mouth differently from most words. It does not arrive and leave quickly. It moves through its syllables the way a river moves through a bend, with a kind of deliberate, unhurried weight, a sense of something larger underneath the sound. The Lingala language of the Congo River Basin is a Bantu family lingua franca, a language carried by traders and fishermen and families moving between communities along thousands of kilometers of waterway. And inside that language, this word has been documented to mean something particular and physical. One who stops the flow of rivers, not a name invented for mystery's sake, a description, a record of what something does to water when it holds itself still inside a current. The way a submerged stone redirects everything moving around it without the stone itself moving at all. That is what the name holds, something present in the water, something large enough that the river has to work around it. The Lingala word arrived in written Western documentation through the work of regional linguists and was cited formally by Roy McCall in his 1987 fieldwork compilation. But the word itself predates all of that by a span of time that written records cannot reach. It was in circulation long before any outsider thought to ask what it meant. It was being used in conversation along the rivers of the Congo Basin, while the people using it were going about the ordinary and specific work of living near water, fishing, traveling by canoe, learning which pools in the river held particular hazards, which stretches of bank were reliable and which were not. The name was not decoration, it was information, and information, in communities where water is both road and food supply, tends to be held carefully. The Likouala region of the Northern Republic of Congo is the part of the Congo Basin where the name has been most persistently documented in connection with a specific animal. The Boha pygmies of the Likouala region are among the indigenous communities whose accounts appear most frequently in Western expedition records, and their oral tradition concerning a large water-dwelling creature is not framed within those communities as legend or mythology in the way that category is sometimes understood by outsiders. What has been documented by researchers working in the region is something closer to practical environmental knowledge, the kind of knowledge passed between people who work and travel in a landscape and who depend on understanding what that landscape contains. A hunter learns the habits of the animals around him, not for storytelling purposes, but because his safety and his family's food depend on that learning. What a Boha hunter knows about a deep river pool, or about a particular stretch of the Likouala Osorb River, or about which areas of the flooded forest are to be approached with a particular kind of attention. That knowledge was transmitted from someone who learned it the same way, from someone who learned it before them, in a chain of careful observation and careful transmission, reaching back through generations. The oral traditions of the Boha describe a large animal that lives in deep river pools, and in Lake Tella, a remote and largely inaccessible body of water deep inside the Likouala swamp. The animal is water-dwelling. It is large. It inhabits places that are deep and slow-moving and difficult for people to approach without some forewarning of their own presence. These traditions are recorded in Western expedition accounts as the primary indigenous testimony concerning the creature, and they are consistent across the documentation in a way that is worth sitting with for a moment, not because consistency proves anything about the nature of the animal described, but because consistency across independent oral traditions, maintained across generations without writing, is itself a form of evidence about what people in the region have persistently believed they knew. The Boha pygmies near the Likouala River have been transmitting this knowledge, whatever it describes, for longer than any written record can confirm. That is simply a fact about the account. It rests there, and it does not resolve easily into any simpler form. A village elder speaking the name near the Likouala River at evening, that is one of the images that persists in thinking about this tradition. The word moving through Lingala in the specific quality of evening light near the water, when the forest is settling into darkness, and the sounds of the river are louder and more particular than they are in the middle of the day. Mokele-mbembe, spoken in that context, in that language, by someone for whom the word is not interesting in the way unusual things are interesting to outsiders, but simply accurate, the way the name of any large and present thing in a person's landscape would be spoken, not with awe, not with drama, with the flat factual weight of something everyone around the fire already knows. The word moves through the air, and it arrives in the mind carrying the shape of something in water, something still, something large enough that the current has to find another way around. There is a recorded European encounter with the evidence of something large and unidentified in the Congo Basin that predates the systematic colonial expeditions by well over a century. The French missionary Abbé Proyart published an account in 1776 describing enormous tracks found in the Congo Basin, a record not of an animal seen, but of the marks an animal had left in soft ground. Proyart described claw marks spaced at intervals, suggesting a creature of tremendous stride. The distance between marks was wide enough that a man standing between them could spread both arms fully and not reach either edge. That image is specific, and its specificity is part of what makes it persist. This was not a report of something vague and atmospheric. It was a report of a physical measurement, a concrete spatial relationship between marks in soft earth that any observer could verify by standing in them and seeing how much room there was. A man's full arm span not reaching either claw mark, the space between them occupied by a living person at full extension and still wider than that person's reach on both sides. Proyart was writing in 1776, but they had plenty of sand. He was a missionary, not a naturalist, and he was recording what he encountered or what was reported to him in the Congo Basin without the benefit of any systematic zoological training. His account is one of the earliest written European references to an unidentified large animal in the region, and it carries the particular quality of early encounter writing, detailed in some ways, unframed in others, more confident about the physical facts than about their interpretation. The claw marks were there, the spacing was what it was. What made them was a question Proyart could not answer, and he did not attempt to. He recorded what existed in the ground and noted its scale and left the rest open, which was the honest thing to do. The years between Proyart's 1776 account and the early 20th century produced additional European encounters with the region as the Congo Basin came increasingly into contact with colonial powers moving through Central Africa for purposes of trade, resource extraction, and territorial administration. German colonial officer Captain Freiherr von Stein zu Lausnitz conducted a zoological expedition to Cameroon in 1913, and during that expedition he compiled what became the most detailed early colonial report of indigenous testimony concerning a large unidentified animal in the rivers of the Congo Basin and adjoining regions. Von Stein documented accounts from multiple indigenous groups, people from different communities with no reason to have coordinated their testimony, all describing something consistent, a large brownish-gray creature with a long flexible neck, living in rivers, occupying the deep slow sections where the water held still and the light did not reach the bottom. Von Stein's notes were handwritten in a colonial garrison, and there is something particular about imagining that document, the field work of a German officer in 1913, sitting in whatever space was available to him, recording a description of a long neck above river water given by an indigenous informant who had traveled several days to reach him. The informant's journey itself is worth noting. Several days of travel through the Congo Basin landscape of the early 20th century, along rivers and through forest, to deliver a description. Whatever motivated that journey, it was not casual. People travel several days with specific purpose, and the purpose here was to describe something the informant had seen or knew to be real. Von Stein recorded what he heard. He compiled it alongside other accounts from other groups. He did not publish the report. It remained in document form until 1954, 4 decades during which the description of the long neck, the brownish-gray skin, the deep river habitat, sat in an archive without circulation in Western scientific or popular literature. Whatever the traditions of the Congo Basin said about the creature during those 40 years, they continued without that particular written record being part of the conversation. The specific physical characteristics that von Stein documented, the brownish-gray coloring, the long flexible neck, the preference for rivers rather than open land. These are details that appear, not once but repeatedly, across accounts gathered from different sources over the following decades. This is one of the things about the Mokele-mbembe testimony record that researchers have found worth continued attention. The accounts do not converge on a vague and general large animal. They converge on particular features, described consistently by people who could not have read each other's testimony, because most of it was never written. A long neck, a small head on top of it, smooth skin, a preference for deep water, no wings, nothing flying. A creature that belongs entirely to the water and the margin of the water and does not claim the air at all. Roy Mackal was a biochemist at the University of Chicago, and his fieldwork in the Likouala region in the years around 1980 represents one of the most systematic Western attempts to document and assess the indigenous testimony concerning Mokele-mbembe. His 1987 compilation of that fieldwork, along with the accounts gathered by herpetologist James Powell during their shared fieldwork, stands as the most detailed English-language record of what people in the Likouala region have said about the creature across multiple generations and multiple communities. The compilation process itself took years of travel, interview, and cross-referencing, the work of someone who found the testimony too specific and too persistent to set aside without serious engagement. One of the accounts that Mackal and Powell documented from their fieldwork in the Likouala region concerns an event involving a community of Boha pygmies and an encounter with the creature that ended in the creature's death. The account, transmitted through community oral tradition, describes a group who killed a Mokele-mbembe and ate it, an event that the tradition records as catastrophic in its consequences. All of the people who had eaten the animal subsequently died, every one of them. The tradition carries this account not as myth in the sense of something illustrative or symbolic, though it is certainly that, but as a specific historical event with specific consequences, a record of what happened the last time someone in the community's memory decided to close the distance between themselves and this animal in the most complete way available by consuming it. The deaths that followed are part of the record. They are built into the tradition as its essential content, the reason the story is transmitted, and the story functions within the community simultaneously as cautionary knowledge. Here is what happened, here is what not to do, and as confirmation of the creature's status, something that carries death inside it, even after it is dead, something that does not become harmless simply because it has been killed. The tradition preserves both the event and its meaning and passes both forward together, intact. The moral and practical weight of that tradition is not separable from the knowledge it contains. A community that transmits environmental knowledge orally, the survival value of a story depends on people remembering it and taking it seriously. A story that results in behavior change, in this case, a lasting avoidance of attempting to kill or eat the creature, is a story that functions. It does what it was transmitted to do. The Boha pygmies near the Likouala River did not need Western researchers to tell them that the creature was to be approached with a certain kind of attention. That knowledge was already there, already embedded in the tradition, already shaping how people moved through the landscape around the deep river pools and the lake. What Mackle and Powell documented was the written record of that tradition, arriving for the first time in a form accessible to Western scientific literature. The tradition itself had been working much longer than that. A Boha hunter at the margin of a deep river pool carries this knowledge with him, without necessarily thinking about it as knowledge in any formal sense. He pauses at the edge of the pool because that is the thing to do at the edge of that kind of pool, in a landscape where the water deepens suddenly and the light does not reach the bottom and the surface is still in a way that moving water is not still. The pause is not fearful, it is attentive, a practiced, learned attentiveness that was passed to him by someone who had practiced it the same way, who had it from someone before them. The attention is calibrated. It knows what it is looking for and what it is listening for. It is the attention of someone who has been told, across the full depth of their community's transmitted knowledge, that something large is here, or has been here, or might be here, and that the appropriate response to that possibility is not panic and not disregard, but a specific quality of watchfulness. Still, quiet, not looking away. The Moabi tree appears in the testimony record in a way that is easy to move past too quickly. The Moabi, its botanical name, Bionella toxisperma, a large tree of the Congo Basin forest, produces a heavy round fruit that drops from the canopy and falls into the water at the forest margin during certain seasons. Indigenous testimony collected by Mackall and cited in his compilation names the Moabi fruit as a food source for the Mokele-mbembe, not a generic suggestion that the creature eats fruit or eats vegetation, but a specific tree, a specific fruit, a specific feeding behavior tied to a specific season and a specific type of location, the edge of the flooded forest where the canopy overhangs the water and the fruit falls where the water is already present. The specificity of this detail is the thing about it. Witnesses describing a creature they have seen or been told about over generations named not just that it was herbivorous, not just that it ate things growing near water, but a particular tree whose fruit it consumed. The Moabi is a real tree. Its fruit is round and heavy and does float briefly before becoming waterlogged. The flooded forest margin where it falls is a real ecosystem that exists throughout the Likouala region in specific seasons. The detail connects the creature being described to an actual ecological context, a real dietary behavior, a verifiable feature of the landscape where the creature is said to live. Whether or not the animal exists in the form described, the testimony is the testimony of people who know this forest in detail, who know which trees produce which fruits in which season, who know where the water rises and where it doesn't, who know the flooded forest margin as a specific place with specific resources in it. That knowledge is in the account. It shaped the account. It makes the account the product of people who were paying careful attention to a real landscape and recording what they knew about it in the form of what they believed lived inside it. There is a quality to the most specific details in a long-standing oral tradition, a quality of having survived because they were accurate in the first place. General details drift across time. Specifics that are wrong tend to be corrected by the experience of people who still live in the landscape the tradition describes. A fruit named wrongly would have been noticed. A tree misidentified would have been recognized as an error by anyone who walked among those trees. The Moabi fruit in the testimony is either a detail that has survived because it was accurate, because people who knew the Moabi tree recognized the described feeding behavior as consistent with what they had observed, or it is a detail so specific and so botanically precise that its persistence in the tradition is difficult to account for by any simpler explanation. Either reading puts the people who transmitted it in the position of careful, attentive knowers of their own environment. Either reading asks to be taken seriously on its own terms. The Moabi fruit that named in Makel's compiled testimony floats on the dark water at the edge of the flooded forest, the way it always has in the season when the water rises high enough to reach the trees. Round and heavy, green and smooth, it sits on the surface for a time before the water works its way in. The forest is quiet in that particular way. That flooded forest is quiet, muffled, the usual sounds absorbed by water and undergrowth, the light filtered through the canopy overhead into something diffuse and even. The fruit drifts slightly with whatever slow current moves through the flooded margin. The surface of the water holds it for a time. The testimony record that names the Moabi fruit does not claim to have watched the creature eat it. It records what people knew about what the creature ate, passed forward through the same community channels through which all practical knowledge of the forest moved, through observation, through account, through transmission between people who needed to understand the landscape they lived inside. The fruit is there in the water. The tree is there above it. The testimony is there in the written record, arrived at from the oral tradition of the Boha Pygmies of the Likouala region, through the field work of researchers who found the details specific enough to include rather than general enough to set aside. Roy Makel cited it as a dietary finding. He did not frame it as evidence of the supernatural or as proof of an impossible animal. He framed it the way a field researcher frames a specific, repeatedly documented, independently confirmed account, as something worth recording exactly as stated, without decoration and without dismissal. The Moabi fruit was named. The Moabi tree is real. The flooded forest margin where both exist is a real place in a real region of a real country, reachable by people willing to travel several days by canoe from the last village before the lake. The tradition that named the fruit is still there. The tree that produces it is still there. The fruit still falls into the water in the appropriate season, round and heavy, hitting the surface of the flooded forest margin with a sound that carries a short distance through the quiet, and then settling and floating for a time before the water takes it down. The name Mokele-mbembe was in the mouths of people along the Likouala River before any written record was made of it. It was being used to describe something real in the landscape, something observed or known through transmission, or both. When the French missionary Proyart found the tracks in 1776, he found them in a landscape where the name was already in circulation. When von Stein traveled through Cameroon in 1913 and gathered indigenous testimony of a long-necked river creature, he was gathering accounts that people had been passing forward in oral form for generations before he arrived to write them down. When Makel and Powell documented the traditions of the Boha Pygmies in the years around 1980, they were receiving a transmission that had been maintained for a time span that the written records do not reach. The name predates all the documentation of it. The knowledge predates the name being recorded. The Moabi fruit floats on the water of the flooded forest margin, as it has, in season, for as long as the Moabi tree has grown in the Likouala region, as long as anyone there has known which fruit to name and which water to name it near. That is the foundation of the testimony record. Not Western expedition, not formal zoological survey, not published scientific claim. A word in Lingala meaning one who stops the flow of rivers. The knowledge of people who live inside the landscape and have transmitted what they know about it across more generations than any single archive holds. The Moabi fruit, round and heavy, on dark water, at the edge of the flooded forest, in the deep and quiet interior of the Likouala swamp. A detail small enough to hold in one hand, and specific enough and persistent enough in the record that it arrives in any honest accounting of this tradition, not as decoration, but as evidence, not of what the creature is, but of what the people who named it were. Careful, particular, paying close attention to a landscape they knew well, and to something they believed moved through it, and to the specific fruit that something ate when it came to the edge of the forest where the water was. From the village of Boha, the water narrows almost immediately. The paddler lifts the canoe away from the last mud bank where the dugouts are pulled up and resting, and within a few strokes, the open air behind closes over. The trees on both sides are not tall in the way of open forest. They lean, they overhang, their root systems extend down into the waterway itself, so that the channel moves between living walls rather than open banks. The roots dark and slick below the waterline, the canopy continuous above. The sound changes as the open air closes. What was ambient and wide becomes intimate and directional, and the only sounds with any distance to them are the ones that travel along the water. This is the approach to Lake Tella, as expedition accounts have consistently described it. A narrowing, a closing, a transition from the navigable world into something that requires different attention. The canoe moves at the pace the water allows, which is not fast. There is no hurrying this waterway. The paddler reads the root clusters and the submerged logs and the variations in current that signal depth change and makes small corrections with each stroke, and the canoe proceeds the way all movement in the Likouala swamp proceeds, carefully and at the landscape's pace rather than the traveler's. The Likouala Osherb swamp covers an estimated 55,000 square kilometers of northern Republic of Congo. That number, documented in geographic and hydrological surveys of the region, is a large number in the way that all truly large numbers are large, too large to be felt directly, available only as a ratio to things already known. 55,000 square kilometers is roughly the area of Croatia, or slightly larger than the state of West Virginia. It is a number that does not resolve into an image on its own. What resolves into an image is the canoe and the narrowing waterway and the root walls and the continuous canopy. Because at human scale, the swamp presents itself not as an area, but as an enclosure, as a series of connected enclosures, each one complete and bounded in the immediate direction of travel, while opening into another one just ahead. The swamp is dominated by slow-moving rivers, flooded forest, and open marshland over waterlogged peat and soft alluvial sediment. These four categories, slow rivers, flooded forest, marsh, and soft sediment, describe not simply a landscape, but a set of conditions that determine what is possible inside it. Overland travel on foot is impossible across large sections, not in the dramatic sense of a cliff face or a gorge, but in the slower, more comprehensive sense of ground that will not hold weight, that has no fixed surface. that is neither land nor water, but a third thing with the reliable properties of neither. The sediment presses in around whatever enters it and releases it slowly. It is not a barrier, it is a medium, and the medium has no roads. The waterways are the roads. They have been the roads for as long as people have lived here, and the people who live here know them the way road users know roads, by their names, their features, their reliable characteristics across seasons, their particular dangers in particular conditions. A paddler moving through the Likouala system toward Lake Tella is not navigating a wilderness in the sense of a featureless, undifferentiated expanse. The paddler is moving through a known landscape, which is simply one that is known through water rather than through pavement, and that requires a different kind of knowledge to move through safely. That knowledge is specific, accumulated, and not available to those who arrive without it. Several days of canoe travel separate Boha village from the lake. The figure varies across accounts depending on paddling conditions, water levels, and the experience of the guide, but the order of magnitude, days rather than hours, is consistent. In those days, there are no resupply points. There are no medical facilities. The communications infrastructure that travelers in other parts of the world assume as background has no presence in this corridor at all. What the traveler carries in the canoe is what the traveler has. The journey is not, in this sense, a series of stages with support available between them. It is a single continuous commitment to the waterway, entered at Boha and concluded when the lake appears, or when some condition makes continuation impossible and return becomes necessary instead. The paddler passes through sections of flooded forest where the water is not in a defined channel but spread broadly beneath the trees, the trunks rising out of it at irregular intervals, the floor of the forest submerged entirely for several months each year. During flood season, landmarks change. A section of bank that in the dry season provides a recognizable reference becomes, in the wet season, simply more water at a slightly different level, indistinguishable from the water around it. This is not disorientation in the alarming sense. Experienced guides carry the route in their knowledge, not their eyes, but it describes something real about what a landscape with a bimodal equatorial rainfall pattern of over 1,800 millimeters in wet years, and seasonal flooding capable of raising water levels by several meters, actually looks like to someone moving through it. It looks like itself in the particular form it takes that week, in that season, at that water level. The flooding is documented in Republic of Congo meteorological records as a reliable feature of the Likouala system, rather than an anomaly. It comes in two pulses aligned with the equatorial rainfall pattern. Between them, the swamp retreats partially. Rivers fall back toward their channels. Exposed banks reappear. The flooded forest floor shows itself briefly as soft, dark earth before the next pulse covers it again. In the rhythm of this place, the wet season is not an interruption of the normal condition. It is half of the normal condition. The swamp is a wet season thing, and a less wet season thing in alternation, and both are equally itself. The soft alluvial sediment that covers the swamp floor deserves its own consideration. Along the margins where open water meets the tree line, there is a transitional zone that is neither fully submerged nor fully exposed, a surface that changes character across meters and across tides and across seasons. In this zone, the sediment records what passes through it. A foot pressed into it leaves an impression that holds for some time before slowly filling back in. Something large pressing into it near the water's margin would leave a clear impression in that soft transitional material, holding its form for however long conditions allowed before the sediment's slow self-repair erased it. The material is both receptive and impermanent. It will take the shape of anything large enough to press it, and then, given enough time and water movement, give that shape back to itself. This is worth holding as a plain fact about the substrate, not as an argument for or against anything within it. It is simply what that material does. The impressions form, the impressions fade, the sediment continues. The regional capital of the Likouala department is Mfondo, a small city on the Ubangi River in northeastern Republic of Congo. From Brazzaville, the capital, Mfondo is reachable primarily by river or by light aircraft, with no paved road providing a direct connection. The distance from Brazzaville to Mfondo by river is substantial, and by air the connection depends on light aircraft and the availability of scheduled services that have not always been reliable. What this means in practical terms is that Mfondo is not easy to reach from outside the country, and that reaching Mfondo is only the beginning of the journey toward the lake. From Mfondo, the journey to Boha village requires several additional days by dugout canoe. The Likouala Oshirb River is the primary route, moving south and east through the swamp system toward the village that sits at the edge of the approach corridor to Lake Tella. In those days of river travel from Mfondo to Boha, there are no towns of any size, no significant infrastructure, no alternatives to the river if weather or water conditions make the river difficult. The journey from a European capital or from an American research institution to the shore of Lake Tella involves a chain of transport connections, international flight, domestic connection, river vessel, dugout canoe, each one less predictable than the last, each one dependent on local knowledge and local conditions that no outside planning fully accounts for. Expedition logistics accounts for multiple expeditions into the Likouala region record this accumulation of difficulty in direct terms. The problem is not any single obstacle. The problem is the chain, each link ordinary enough on its own, the chain as a whole, generating a complexity that compounds with distance from the starting point. The canoe moves through a narrow waterway in the swamp forest at first light, the surface ahead steel-colored and flat, the overhanging trees forming a tunnel through which gray morning light falls in broken pieces on the water. The paddler's strokes are even and unhurried, producing a small sound at each entry and a smaller sound at each exit. The canoe tracking forward with the kind of steadiness that comes from long familiarity. On both sides, the root systems extend from the banks into the water, some of them submerged, some visible just above the surface, their texture dark and fibrous. A hand trailed in the water from the side of the canoe would brush against roots before it found open water, the channel that narrow, the root systems that close. This is not a hostile environment for the people who live within it. For the Boha community, and for others distributed across the Likouala region, this waterway system is the ordinary texture of daily movement, for fishing, for travel between communities, for the passage of goods and messages and people through a landscape that requires water for its roads. The strangeness of the swamp is a relative quality, belonging to those who arrive from outside it. From inside, it is simply the place, with its particular character and its particular requirements, known over generations, moved through with the skill that accumulated knowledge provides. But from outside, from the perspective of an expedition team arriving in Mfondo from a Northern Hemisphere research institution with equipment cases and timelines and supply lists, the swamp presents itself as genuinely difficult to survey. This is not a characterization imposed on it. It is a property it holds by virtue of its actual geography, its hydrology, its substrate, and its distance from the infrastructure that makes systematic survey possible in other landscapes. Aerial survey is complicated by the continuous canopy, which in large sections offers no ground penetration to optical instruments. Ground survey by foot is blocked in many sections by the sediment conditions. Survey by boat is possible along the waterways, but does not access the territory between them, which in the flooded forest sections may constitute the majority of the area. The gaps between known data points in the Likouala swamp are real geographic gaps produced by real conditions, and they are large. Lake Tella sits within this landscape as a roughly circular body of water, approximately 8.5 square kilometers in surface area, with an average depth of around 5 meters, entirely surrounded by dense swamp forest. Expedition geographic records from Mackall's 1981 fieldwork establish these dimensions, and they are dimensions worth holding for a moment in their particularity. 8.5 square kilometers of open water, roughly 3 kilometers across at the widest point, enclosed on all sides by forest, with no road in or out, reachable only by the canoe route through Boha. The shape of the lake, roughly circular, means that from any point on its shoreline, the tree line is visible in every direction, the forest closing the horizon at a uniform distance, no break in the canopy rim, through which anything beyond the forest is visible from the water. The lake was known to the local communities long before any outside expedition confirmed its existence. It figures in Boha community knowledge as a specific place with specific characteristics, a named body of water, a destination, a location attributed with particular significance. The accounts that associate the lake with unusual animal activity were not generated by Western expeditions asking leading questions in previously untouched communities. They predate the Western expeditions in the sense that when those expeditions arrived and began conducting interviews, the lake and its associations were already established features of the local geography and the local oral tradition. The expeditions found the knowledge there. They did not deposit it. The approach to the lake from Boha follows the narrow waterways through the flooded forest, and then at the point where the forest opens, arrives at the lake's surface. This transition, described in expedition accounts and in local knowledge both, is a specific physical experience, the narrowness of the forest waterway giving way to the open expanse of the circular lake, the tree line stepping back on all sides simultaneously, the sky appearing overhead where the canopy had been. The lake is a clearing in the forest, in the sense that all lakes are clearings, an absence of solid ground filled with water, bounded by the vegetation that surrounds it, but a clearing in the Likouala swamp, visible only from within the swamp, accessible only through days of narrow waterway travel, has a quality of enclosure rather than openness, even when the sky is available above it. It is an open space inside a closed one. The forest holds it. The Congo Basin rainforest, of which the Likouala system is a component, is the second largest tropical rainforest on Earth at approximately 3.3 million square kilometers. The Amazon exceeds it in total area. Nothing else does. Within those 3.3 million square kilometers, the documented megafauna is substantial. Nile crocodiles have been recorded in the region exceeding 5 meters in length, animals whose mass and dimension, seen at distance or in poor visibility, would present as something very large and potentially unfamiliar to someone without prior experience of large crocodilians. African rock pythons, themselves among the largest snakes on Earth, move through this ecosystem. African forest elephants, smaller than their savanna relatives, but still substantial animals, cross bodies of water in the region, a behavior documented photographically and relevant to the interpretation of large dark shapes observed crossing lake surfaces. The ecosystem is genuinely inhabited by animals of a scale that alters the baseline sense of what scale is possible here. This does not explain everything that has been described in the Likouala region. It establishes the context in which descriptions have been given, a context in which very large animals are real residents, in which visibility conditions are often poor, in which distance over water is difficult to estimate accurately without references for scale, and in which an experienced local observer and an inexperienced outside visitor are not equally equipped to identify what they are looking at from a dugout canoe at 50 meters in morning light. The large animals are real. The poor visibility conditions are real. The difficulty of accurate distance estimation over open water is real. These are features of the environment, not arguments. They belong to the same patient accounting that the swamp itself requires. A Nile crocodile at 5 meters in length, motionless in a Likouala tributary at dusk, does not advertise itself. Its back, just breaking the water's surface, presents as a long, dark shape, a log shape, familiar enough that an experienced traveler recognizes it as a crocodile through a reading of subtle secondary signals rather than through any dramatic visual cue. The stillness is part of its presence. The mass of the animal is entirely present, lying low in the water, its outline ambiguous in the flat light of late afternoon, its distinction from the dark water around it minimal until it moves. Movement, when it comes, is fast and complete. The shape that was a log is no longer a log, and then the surface closes over and the shape is gone. At distance, at 200 meters, at 300 meters, across open water with no reference points for scale, the reading becomes harder. What provides the crocodile cue at 20 meters does not provide it reliably at 300, where the animal's outline resolves into a long dark shape against water, low in the surface, without the secondary signals that identify it at shorter range. This is not a theoretical point about optical physics. It is a practical point about what people in boats actually see, and what they make of what they see in the conditions that the Likouala waterways provide. The trees at the lake margin are various, and among them the Mokele-mbembe toxosperma is present in the flooded forest zone around Lake Tella. It is a large emergent tree of the Congo Basin forest, producing heavy oil-rich fruits that fall into the water at certain times of year and float for a period before becoming waterlogged and sinking. On the dark water near the swamp forest margins, these fruits are present seasonally, round and heavy, drifting from the canopy into the lake surface and the tributary margins, present for the time their buoyancy allows, and then gone. The Moabi fruit appears in accounts of the Likouala region in a specific context that sits within the broader record of what local communities have described about the ecosystem and its animals. It belongs to the landscape, not as a symbol, but as a botanical fact. A tree that grows here, a fruit that falls here, a detail that anyone moving through this part of the Likouala swamp would know and could name with precision. The fact that it can be named precisely, that it has a specific tree and a specific fruit attached to it rather than being a general reference to vegetation or food, is its most notable quality as a piece of information. It is the kind of detail that arrives in testimony, not because it was asked for, but because it belongs to what the speaker knows. And what the speaker knows is the landscape in the particular form it takes in this place, in this season, near this water. The sun, when it reaches the lake's surface, comes in at a low angle in the morning, crossing the water from the eastern side of the forest rim toward the western side, the light moving across the lake's surface over the course of a few hours before the canopy on the western shore intercepts it, and the lake returns to the ambient light of the enclosed forest interior. In that window of direct light, the lake's surface is visible in detail, its texture, its small movements, whatever breaks its surface. Outside that window, and in the even more enclosed conditions of the swamp waterways leading to the lake, the light is what it is, filtered, indirect, sufficient for movement, but not for the kind of resolved visual detail that makes identification at distance reliable. The swamp does not conceal things dramatically. It does not hold things back with any intention. It is simply a landscape with particular optical and physical properties. Dense canopy, dark water, soft substrate, narrow waterways, enclosed light conditions, large distances, poor acoustic direction sense, and the constant presence of large animals whose shapes at distance are not always what they appear to be at close range. These properties have been present in the Likouala system since long before any expedition arrived to note them, and they will be present long after any expedition departs. They are not a feature of the mystery, they are a feature of the place. The mystery, whatever it is or is not, exists within them. The journey back from Lake Teli to Boha, and then from Boha through the river system to Mfondo, and then from Mfondo to whatever starting point the traveler came from. This return journey carries the same requirements as the outward one. The same water, the same time, the same dependence on the waterway and the paddler and the conditions. What was learned or not learned at the lake, what was observed or not observed, what was photographed or not photographed. All of this travels back in the same canoe, at the same pace, through the same narrow channels, past the same root walls and the same overhanging trees, back through the transition point where the forest opens to Boha's mud bank and the pulled-up dugouts, and the sound of the river moving past the village in its ordinary daily way. The lake remains behind. It does not follow. It stays in the enclosure of its forest rim, its roughly circular surface undisturbed by departure, its dark water 5 meters deep at average, its shoreline a continuous wall of trees with no road in and no road out, a few days' canoe travel from the last village on the route, and many more days than that from the nearest city with a landing strip, and a long flight from anywhere else in the world. It stays there in whatever weather arrives. It stays there in the wet season, when the surrounding forest floor is submerged, and the waterways rise, and the approach channels change their character. It stays there in the dry season, when the forest floor reappears, and the navigational landmarks settle back into their visible positions. It is a lake in a swamp, surrounded by forest, in a part of the world that is genuinely difficult to reach, and genuinely difficult to survey once reached. These are not qualifications on a mystery, they are descriptions of a place. The place is large, the place is wet, the place holds its character in every season, in every year, whether anyone is on the water looking at it or not. The canopy closes above the return canoe. The waterway narrows again behind the traveler, and the open lake surface disappears from view, and the only sounds are the ones that travel along the water, the paddle stroke, the root brushing the hull, the small movements in the vegetation above that register as sound before they register as any identifiable source. The light is the light of the interior. The water is the dark water of the enclosed channel. Ahead, still some days distant, the village of Boha waits with its mud bank and its dugouts and its knowledge of this route, this water, this particular stretch of the Likouala system. Behind, the lake continues. Its roughly circular surface holds the light it has. Its forest rim stands at the edge of the water in every direction, continuous and unbroken. The trees present as they have been present for as long as there has been forest here, which is a very long time, longer than any expedition account, longer than any colonial record, longer than any written document that touches this place. The lake holds the forest around it. The forest holds the lake. The dark water, 5 meters deep, sits beneath whatever floats on its surface. Moabi fruits in their season, the small disturbances of rain, the wakes left by things that cross it. The wakes spread and then quiet. The surface becomes flat again. The forest rim stands. The lake continues in its circular stillness, holding whatever it holds, in the particular form it takes on this day, at this water level, in this season of the bimodal year. In 1980, in a village somewhere in the Likouala region of northern Congo, James Powell laid a set of printed illustrations flat on a surface and waited. The illustrations showed animals, some living, some extinct, arranged without emphasis or hierarchy, one beside the other on the page. A local fisherman leaned forward to look at them. He was someone who had spent years on the rivers of the Likouala, who knew the depth of particular pools and the behavior of the water at particular times of year, and he had reported seeing something that had remained in his account with the kind of specificity that tends to outlast embellishment. Powell watched as the man studied the page. Then the fisherman placed a finger on one of the illustrations. Not the hippopotamus, not the crocodile, which the man knew well and whose length and temperament were familiar to him, not the monitor lizard, not the elephant. The finger came to rest on the long-necked sauropod dinosaur, and Powell noted what he was looking at and wrote it down. That was the methodology. Structured, specific, documented. Powell and Roy McCow, a biochemist from the University of Chicago who had organized the expedition, had designed the illustration comparison to reduce the possibility of suggestion, to give a witness a visual field wide enough that a known animal, if that was what had been seen, would be available as the obvious match. The living animals were included precisely because they were the most plausible candidates. If a fisherman who claimed to have seen something in a deep Likouala River pool immediately pointed to the hippopotamus and said, "Yes, that is close to what I saw," that result would have been noted with equal care. What was noted from multiple independent witnesses in separate villages who had not compared their accounts with one another was that the hippopotamus was consistently rejected. The crocodile was rejected. The large monitor lizard, which can exceed 2 meters in length and is a known inhabitant of the swamp, was placed to one side without hesitation. The long-necked sauropod was chosen, not by a single witness in a single village on a single afternoon, but by multiple people in different locations, across interviews conducted over the course of the expedition. Mokele regarded this as the most significant finding of the 1980 fieldwork. Not a sighting, not a photograph. A consistent pattern in what witnesses chose and what they turned away from, recorded under a methodology designed to give the known animals every advantage. The 1980 expedition had not attempted to reach Lake Tella. The logistical requirements of penetrating to the lake from the nearest village of Boha were considerable enough that the expedition's resources were allocated primarily to interview work along the river systems. There was enough to document without going all the way to the lake. The witness accounts were themselves a body of evidence, and Mokele and Powell spent their time in the Likouala, gathering them carefully, village by village, informant by informant, letting the pattern that emerged from separate sources do whatever it was going to do without assistance. What it did was repeat itself. The description came back in its major features from people who had not spoken to each other about it. The long, flexible neck, the smooth skin, the large body, roughly hippopotamus-sized, set on wide column-like legs, The deep pools and the territorial behavior on the water, no wings, no crest, a specific kind of large aquatic herbivorous thing, named, described, and consistently described, in a region where the rivers are deep enough and the swamp extensive enough and the visibility through the surface of dark water sufficiently limited that the explanation for what people had seen remained genuinely open. Mackle came home from 1980 with notes rather than film, with a pattern rather than proof, and he made plans to go back. The following year, 1981, produced two separate attempts on the Likouala by two separate teams who were not coordinating their efforts. The first to leave was Herman Registers, an engineer from California who had organized his own privately funded expedition with his wife Kia. The Registers expedition is notable in the documented record, primarily for something that the larger and better resourced McCall expedition, traveling concurrently, did not manage. It actually reached Lake Tella. The logistics of getting through the swamp from Boha to the lake were exactly as demanding as every previous account had suggested. The waterways narrow, the canopy closes in above a traveling party. The sediment underfoot in the sections that require overland movement is not solid ground. It is the upper layer of a peat and alluvial substrate that absorbs a boot and does not release it cleanly. Regusters and his team moved through this terrain over several days, and they arrived at the lake and they spent time on its surface, and what Regusters reported having seen there has remained in the case file in the form it was recorded ever since. At approximately 300 meters distance across the water, according to Regusters' account, something appeared on the surface of Lake Tella that was large enough and shaped in a manner sufficiently unusual that he and his wife both stopped what they were doing and stood at the edge of the lake watching it. The distance was significant. 300 meters is enough to make the features of a large animal difficult to resolve, especially across dark water with forest reflecting back from the surface on all sides. Regusters described a long neck. He described what appeared to be a large body beneath the water. He had brought recording equipment, and he reported capturing vocalizations from the lake at night, low, resonant sounds with a quality he described as trumpeting, vocalizations that he believed were attributable to the animal he had seen. He returned from Lake Tella with blurred photographs and a plaster cast of a track he had found at the lake's edge. The photographs showed a gray-green expanse of water with a shape at the center that is genuinely difficult to classify. It might be a neck rising from the surface. It might be a partially submerged log disturbed by current or wind. The shape is present in the image. What produced the shape is not resolved by looking at the image, and it was not resolved by any subsequent analysis. The track casting drew similar conclusions, consistent with a large animal, consistent with several candidate large animals, not sufficiently detailed to constitute identification. The vocalizations were not matched to any known species in the region with confidence, but audio quality and the circumstances of the recording did not allow for rigorous spectral analysis. Registers returned with the most material evidence the lake had produced up to that point, and every piece of it remained open. Roy Mackle's 1981 expedition, which was larger and carried more scientific equipment and included zoologist J. Richard Greenwell as a member of the team, did not reach Lake Tella. The logistical difficulties that Registers had managed to push through proved for Mackle's team ultimately unsurmountable in the window available to them. Trail conditions deteriorated. The supply arrangement required to sustain a larger group over the extended approach proved more complicated in execution than in planning. The team moved as far as conditions permitted, and then held at their furthest point along the route to the lake, and from that position They worked the surrounding area, conducted interviews, and listened. What the team reported hearing on at least one occasion during the nights they spent camped near the river was a vocalization, large, low, not immediately attributable to any known swamp species familiar to the team members present, a sound that emerged from the water and the surrounding darkness, and then did not repeat, and that Greenwell noted in the expedition record as something he could not classify with confidence against the background fauna. A sound in the dark over a river in the Likouala swamp, noted, recorded in the expedition account, and not explained. The team came home without having seen the lake. The sound remained in the notes. Marcelin Agnagna was a Congolese wildlife biologist employed by the Direction de la Faune et des Aires Protégées, the Congolese government body responsible for wildlife management in the region. In April of 1983, he led a government-sanctioned expedition to Lake Tella, a different kind of expedition from the Western, privately funded efforts that had preceded it, carried by institutional authority rather than outside funding, staffed in part by Congolese nationals, rooted in the formal administrative relationship the Congolese government maintained with its own territory. Agnagna reached Lake Tella on April 23, 1983. He reported seeing something in the lake that he subsequently described in a formal written account. The account states that at a distance of approximately 300 meters across the lake's surface, an animal became visible that was unlike anything in the fauna Agnagna knew from his professional work in the region. He described a reddish-brown neck held between 1 and 1.5 meters above the waterline. He described a small oval head at the end of that neck, positioned in a way that he interpreted as alert, oriented toward the shore where he stood. He described a wide, dark gray back visible at the waterline, the body below the surface, large enough in what could be inferred from the back's visible width to suggest an animal of considerable mass. He estimated the visible part of the neck at between 1 and 1.5 meters above the water's surface, the head small relative to the neck's length, the entire posture one of stillness, and what he interpreted as attention toward the observer. He described the animal as remaining visible in this position for approximately 20 minutes before submerging with minimal surface disturbance, a controlled descent, not a startled dive, the water closing over the shape without a significant wake or concussion. He had brought a camera, and the camera, he stated in his account, had been inadvertently set to macro focus, a close-range setting designed for filming small objects at short distances, which rendered any footage taken at 300 meters useless. He filmed it. The footage was not recoverable. The camera was set to the wrong focal length, and 20 minutes of observation at Lake Tella on April 23, 1983, resolved into an account written down in formal language and filed in the expedition record, the image held only in Agnagna's own description of it. The specificity of that account, the reddish-brown color of the neck, the approximate height above the waterline, the oval shape of the head, the 20-minute duration, the wide, dark back, has been noted by those who have studied the Mokele-mbembe case as either the most credible sighting in the documented record or the most frustratingly unverifiable. Agnagna was a trained wildlife biologist. He was not a Westerner with a pre-existing framework built from cryptozoology or science fiction. He was a Congolese government employee with professional experience assessing large African fauna, standing on the shore of a lake he had traveled to in the execution of government-sanctioned work. He filed a report. The report says what it says. There is no film. There is no corroborating image. There is the account, precise and specific in its details, and the lake, which was the same lake the following morning that it had been the morning of the 23rd, holding whatever it held beneath 5 meters of dark equatorial water, its circular shoreline of unbroken forest, exactly as it had always been. It is worth noting that the 300 meters cited in both Register's 1981 account and Agnagna's 1983 account as the approximate distance to what they observed is a significant distance. 300 meters across dark water, with forest reflection complicating the surface, in equatorial light that carries its own particular quality of glare and shadow depending on the time of day. At that distance, the features of a large animal would be visible in outline, but not in detail. A long dark neck and a wide back and a controlled submersion would be the features that registered at 300 meters. Whether those features belonged to what witnesses believed they saw, or to something else of comparable outline that the distance prevented from being precisely resolved, is one of the questions the accounts have never fully answered. The lake held 300 meters between the observer and the shape, and those 300 meters are as much a part of the documented record as anything else. The next significant body of documentary evidence from Lake Tella arrived in 1992, carried out not by a ground team, but by a light aircraft. A Nippon television expedition organized a camera flight over the lake, a different approach to the problem of documentation than anything the ground expeditions had managed, using altitude and mobility to survey a surface that had proved so difficult to reach and observe from water level. The aircraft flew over Lake Tella, and the camera captured footage. In that footage, a large dark object, approximately 5 meters in length, is visible, moving across the surface of the lake, leaving behind it a distinctive wake, the clean V-shaped spread of water displaced by something moving with purpose and with mass, the kind of wake that requires a body of significant dimension to produce it. The surrounding water in the frame was otherwise undisturbed. The forest rim of the lake was visible at the edges of the shot, the circular shoreline unbroken in every direction. The object moved. The wake spread behind it. The footage was clear enough to show these features: the shape, the size, the wake, the direction of movement, the otherwise still water around it, and it has remained in the documentary record of the Mokele-mbembe case, in the form it was captured, available to be reviewed by anyone who wants to review it. The mainstream zoological interpretation of the Nippon television footage, arrived at by researchers examining the shot against the known behavioral repertoire of large animals documented in the Congo Basin, is that the object in the frame is most consistent with an African forest elephant swimming across the lake. African forest elephants are smaller than their savanna relatives, but still animals of considerable mass, and their lake-crossing behavior has been photographically documented in the region. An elephant swimming across a body of water of the scale of Lake Tella would produce a surface wake of exactly the dimensions visible in the footage. It would appear from the air as a large dark shape approximately the size of what the footage shows. The trunk, held above the surface during a swim, would produce an elongation of the visible profile that could read at distance and from altitude in the way the footage's shape reads. This interpretation has been put forward as the most parsimonious account of what the footage captured, and it has not been definitively refuted. The footage does not resolve into something that cannot be an elephant. Whether it is an elephant is a different question, and the footage does not resolve that either. What the footage definitively shows is a large dark shape, a 5-meter estimated length, a clean V-shaped wake, and an otherwise undisturbed surface on a lake, enclosed by unbroken swamp forest. Those are the facts the camera recorded. Everything beyond them is interpretation, and the interpretations have not yet converged. The cumulative quality of the expedition record, 1980, 1981, 1983, 1992, and the smaller subsequent efforts that followed in the years after, is not the quality of a question being answered. It is the quality of a question being documented from multiple angles without any single angle producing a resolution. What each expedition contributed was not a conclusion, but a data point, a set of witness interviews with a consistent pattern, a blurred photograph, and an ambiguous plaster cast, or a sound heard over a river at night that could not be classified, a formal written account from a trained biologist who watched something for 20 minutes with a camera set to the wrong focal length, an aerial footage frame showing a large shape and a clean wake on a circular lake from which there is no road in or out. Each data point was added to the file. The file grew. The question continued. The expeditions are, among other things, a record of what the terrain required. To reach Lake Tella from the nearest village required days of canoe travel and overland movement through a swamp floor that did not behave like solid ground. A team that was large enough to carry proper scientific equipment was also large enough to make resupply difficult. A team that was small and nimble enough to move efficiently through the terrain was not large enough to carry the equipment that would make definitive documentation possible. Regusters reached the lake with a small team and came back with photographs that were too blurred to resolve. Mackerel reached the edge of the route with a larger team and never got to the lake at all. Agnagna reached the lake with official government backing and stood on its shore with a camera set to macro focus. The terrain was not on anyone's side. The swamp was not withholding evidence deliberately. It was simply the swamp, wet, dark, wide, deep, capable of absorbing a traveling party's momentum and resources and still being there afterward, exactly as it was. The expeditions moved through it and emerged carrying what they had managed to gather, and what they had managed to gather was, in each case, something, and in each case, something less than enough. The years after 1992 produced additional smaller expeditions and survey attempts, none of which produced documentary evidence of a different order from what had already been gathered. The pattern of the record is the record's most consistent feature. Witnesses consistently describe a large aquatic animal with specific physical characteristics. Expeditions consistently reach the region and gather testimony and hear sounds and occasionally claim visual observations at significant distance across dark water and return without images or physical evidence of a quality that would close the question. The lake continues to be the lake. The river pools in the Likouala continue to be the depth they are. The swamp continues to be the swamp, wet and extensive, and genuinely difficult to survey in the comprehensive way that a question of this scale would require. The file stays open. The expeditions stay in the record. The testimony stays in the record. The blurred photograph and the formal written account and the aerial footage frame and the sounds heard over the river at night, all of it stays in the record, documented and specific and unresolved, the way evidence tends to stay when the question at its center has not been answered. What the expedition sequence produced, taken together as a body of documented activity rather than as a series of individual attempts, is a record of sustained human effort, directed at a specific question in a specific landscape, over more than a decade of organized fieldwork. The question was approached by scientists and by private investigators and by government employees and by film crews from ground level and from the air in the wet season and in the dry season, with interview methodology and with photographic equipment and with recording equipment and with the unaided eye at 300 meters across dark water. None of the approaches produced the thing that would have closed the question, a clear image, a physical specimen, a recoverable recording, unambiguous enough to constitute identification. What they produced was everything else: the witness interviews, the noted sounds, the blurred photographs, the misit cameras, the track castings, the aerial footage frames, the expedition accounts, all of it gathered carefully, all of it still in the file, all of it, in the specific and non-dramatic sense of the word, unexplained. The 1992 aerial footage frame holds still in the memory of the case, the way evidence holds still when it has been examined and not resolved, a dark shape moving across a lake's surface, the clean V of a wake spreading behind it, the surrounding water otherwise undisturbed, the forest canopy enclosing everything at the edges of the shot in an unbroken ring. The shape is approximately 5 meters in length. It is moving with purpose. The lake is Lake Tella. The year is 1992, and the footage was taken from an aircraft crossing above a surface that ground expeditions had been working towards since 1980. And what the camera found when it finally had a clear view from altitude was a large dark shape and a wake and an otherwise still and circular lake, exactly as closed and exactly as wide as it had always been. The footage is in the archive. The shape is in the footage. The interpretation of the shape is still, after everything, filed under competing explanations, one of which is an elephant crossing the water as African forest elephants in the Congo Basin have been documented to do, and one of which is something the record has not yet named, with enough certainty to stop filing the question under open. The skin color came first. Across the compiled testimony gathered from Likouala region, witnesses over several decades, the first detail that returned most reliably was not the neck, not the size, not the behavior. It was the color of the skin, reddish-brown, smooth, not the gray-green of a crocodile or the rough dark hide of a hippopotamus, but something distinct enough that multiple witnesses from different villages along different stretches of the river, speaking to different researchers in different years, reached for the same approximation when asked to describe what they had seen: reddish-brown. The consistency of that detail across independent accounts that had not been compared is what Roy McCall recorded first in his compiled fieldwork, and it is where the description of the animal is worth beginning. From the surface of it, in the color that came back again and again like a word remembered in the middle of a different conversation. From the skin, the accounts moved outward and upward. The body, in the compiled testimony McCall assembled across his fieldwork in the region, was described as roughly the size of a hippopotamus or a small elephant, a mass that would displace considerable water when it moved, heavy enough to press the swamp mud down through several layers of soft alluvial soil, large enough to be visible at a considerable distance across open water. The legs were described as column-like, thick and straight in the way that an animal of that weight would require to bear itself through shallow water or across the swamp margins. The skin, again smooth, no scales, no dorsal crest, no ridges along the back. The neck long and flexible, rising from the body in a way that multiple witnesses independently described as capable of bending and turning, and at the top of the neck, a small head, disproportionate to the size of the body below it, described across the accounts with a specificity that held even when the surrounding details varied. No wings. That absence is worth noting specifically because it was noted by the researchers who compiled the testimony. In the indigenous accounts collected from Likouala region, witnesses and recorded in McCall's 1987 publication, no wings were ever attributed to the creature in credible testimony. No fins either, in any description that met the basic consistency standards McCall applied to his compilation. The animal that the collected witnesses described was a large, smooth-skinned, long-necked, herbivorous creature that moved through deep river pools and open lake water, and what it conspicuously was not, wings, fins, dorsal crest, scales, was documented with the same care as what it was said to be. Among the fishermen near the Bay River confluence, descriptions of a large animal had accumulated across many years, across many separate occasions, carried by different individuals who had seen something at different times, and who had, as far as the documentation established, not compared their accounts before speaking to the researchers who eventually recorded them. What Mackle noted in his 1987 book was the quality of that consistency, not that every detail matched perfectly, but that the central description held across witnesses who had no documented opportunity to coordinate. The neck, the small head, the reddish-brown smooth skin, the size, these returned. The animal in the accounts was not a single witness's impression amplified into legend. It was a description that multiple independent people had arrived at by different routes in different seasons along different stretches of the same river system. A fisherman near the Bay River confluence, speaking with Mac Hale in 1980, shaped the air with his hands to show the way the neck rose from the water and the way the head sat on top of it. Small relative to the neck, he indicated, the head turned and held in a way that suggested awareness of what was on the shore. The same gesture Mackle recorded was made by a different witness in a different village the following day. Not the same verbal description reaching him secondhand, the same physical gesture, generated independently to describe the same quality of the animal's attention. The head small, the neck rising, the awareness directed outward toward the bank. Mackle noted it without amplifying it, recording both instances in the same fieldwork compilation as parallel observations rather than as proof, simply placing them in the record where they could be read side by side. Marcelin Agnagna's formal written account of the 23rd of April 1983 added a dimension of measured detail that distinguished it from the compiled fishermen's testimonies. Agnagna, a wildlife biologist employed by the Direction de la Faune et des Aires Protégées of the Republic of Congo, wrote that he observed at Lake Tella a reddish-brown neck held approximately 1 to 1.5 meters above the waterline, with a small oval head at its end. The back visible above the water was wide and dark gray. The animal remained visible, by his estimate, for approximately 20 minutes before submerging, and the submersion itself was described as producing minimal surface disturbance, the water closing over the animal without the kind of turbulent splash a large body entering water forcefully would generate. It went down in the way he described it, as though disappearing rather than diving. The camera in Agnagna's hands during those 20 minutes was set to macro focus. He stated this in his formal account, that the camera's focal setting was incorrect for the distance he was observing from, approximately 300 meters, and that the footage he attempted to capture was therefore not usable as documentation. The animal held its neck above the water, turned its small oval head, and was present at the surface of Lake Tella for what Agnagna estimated as 20 minutes, and the instrument that might have recorded it was misconfigured in a way that was not discovered until the documentation opportunity had passed. This detail appears in his formal written account without elaboration. It sits in the record the way unexplained things often sit, specific, irreversible, available to any interpretation that follows the facts, honestly to where they stop. The behavioral accounts carried something the purely physical descriptions did not, a quality of the animal's relationship to the water and to the people who traveled on it. Indigenous accounts collected by Mackle from villages along the Likouala River and near Lake Tella described the creature overturning dugout canoes in territorial encounters. The framing of this behavior across the independent testimonies was consistent, not predatory, not an animal attacking in order to feed. The canoe overturning accounts described a creature acting to remove something from its territory, aggressive in the way a large animal defending a space it considers its own is aggressive rather than in the way a hunting animal closes the distance to a target. The creature, in these accounts, was herbivorous. Multiple independent testimonies place this clearly. It ate plants, not fish, not people. The aggression was territorial. A dugout canoe on a Likouala tributary sits low in the water, its hull narrow, its freeboard minimal, the paddler positioned close enough to the river surface that the depth of the water is felt rather than measured. Moving through a section of river where the channel deepens beneath overhanging trees, the canoe offers very little between the person in it and whatever occupies the water below. The locations described across the canoe overturning accounts were consistent in this regard. Sections of river where the depth increased suddenly, where the water darkened beneath overhanging canopy, where the river narrowed or pooled, places where a large animal occupying the deep water below would be closest to the surface that a canoe crosses. The geography of the accounts was not incidental. The witnesses who described these encounters described them in specific places on specific rivers, not at random points along the water system, but at the kinds of locations where depth and cover converged. The illustration comparison method that Powell and Mackle used during their 1980 fieldwork produced its most discussed result, not in what witnesses selected, but in what they rejected before selecting. A witness who claimed personal experience of the animal was shown a range of illustrations: hippopotamus, African forest elephant, Nile crocodile, monitor lizard, and asked whether any of them matched what had been described. In the documented cases where witnesses worked through the full illustration set, hippopotamus was rejected, elephant was rejected, large crocodile was rejected, monitor lizard was rejected. The rejection of each of these was documented alongside the reason a witness offered when one was given. The legs were not right, the neck was wrong, the size was different, the head shape did not correspond. After the rejections, the finger moved to the long-necked sauropod illustration. What the illustration comparison methodology established, and what it could not establish, is worth holding carefully. It established that multiple witnesses, shown a set of known animals, consistently found those known animals inadequate to describe what they reported encountering. That is documented. Whether the sauropod illustration they selected as closest was selected because it resembled what they saw, or because the interview context shaped the selection, or because no other option in the illustration set was capable of capturing something that might have been a known animal seen in unusual conditions, these remain genuinely open questions, and the researchers who have examined Mackle's methodology most carefully have raised them formally in the published literature. The result is not confirmation, and it is a documented outcome of a specific interview process, preserved in the record, carrying both its interest and its complications intact. The Moabi tree fruit appeared in the compiled testimonies, not as a vague reference to the creature's diet, but as a specific named food item, given with botanical particularity. The Moabi tree, a hardwood native to the Central African rainforest, producing round, oil-rich fruit, was named across multiple independent witness accounts collected by Mokele as something the creature was known to eat, not water plants, generically, not vegetation broadly. The Moabi fruit specifically, falling from the canopy into flooded swamp margins, floating briefly on the dark water before becoming waterlogged and sinking. the specificity of the food item, a particular tree, a particular fruit, named consistently enough that McCall recorded it as a dietary finding rather than an incidental detail, carried within it the suggestion of a tradition of careful observation accumulated over time, people who had watched the same water long enough to know what drew something large to it. The Moabi tree grows near the margins of flooded forest in the Likouala region, its fruit heavy enough that when it drops from the canopy in season, the sound of it hitting the water is audible at a distance. The swamp margins where the trees stand are the same margins where the deep river pools form, where the ground softens past the point where a person can walk, and the water takes over, dark and slow moving, carrying whatever floats or sinks into its deeper channels. A fruit falling from a Moabi tree into that water would drift on the surface in the same place, at the same depth margins, where multiple witnesses place the animal in their accounts. The food item and the location the animal occupied were not described separately. They were described as belonging to the same geography, the tree above and whatever fed from it below, in the particular intersection of canopy and swamp water that made up the known world of the people who had watched it across many seasons. Among the consistencies in the compiled testimony record, one of the most discussed is also one of the most difficult to evaluate precisely: the absence of certain features. A creature that might have been explained as a misidentified large reptile would, in some conditions, be expected to produce descriptions including scales, or a ridged back, or a broad flat tail at the water's surface. None of these features appeared with any consistency in the credible indigenous testimony McCall compiled. The animal described was smooth-skinned, and the smoothness was noted specifically enough in multiple independent accounts that it appears in the compilation as a characteristic rather than an absence of description. The witnesses did not fail to describe the skin texture. They described it, and what they described was smooth. That absence of scale detail, held against the presence of other precise details, like the neck length and the head size and the color, carries a quality that the researchers recorded without resolving, specific enough to be informative, quiet enough to remain open. The distribution of the testimony across the Likouala region is worth attending to as well, because the accounts did not cluster around a single village or a single stretch of river. McCall collected descriptions from witnesses along different parts of the Likouala-Osherb River system, from villages at different distances from Lake Tella, from people whose daily relationship with the water varied considerably. A fisherman whose work takes him daily onto the river for years develops a different relationship to it than a hunter who crosses it seasonally, and both of them develop different knowledge than a person who has lived near a particular deep pool since childhood and watched its surface through many water levels and many seasons. The testimony McCall assembled drew from people in different positions relative to the water, and the core description held across those positions: the reddish-brown skin, the long neck, the small head, the column-like legs, the herbivorous behavior, in a way that felt to the researchers at least less like the spread of a single story through a population, and more like the accumulation of observations from multiple angles. Mackle's 1987 book, A Living Dinosaur? In Search of Mokele-mbembe, published by E.J. Brill, assembled this compiled testimony in a form designed to allow the reader to examine it as an evidentiary record rather than a series of anecdotes. The structure of the compilation, separating descriptions by region, by witness, by date, by the conditions under which the account was collected, reflects the methodology of a researcher who wanted the underlying pattern, if there was one, to be visible without editorial amplification. Whether the pattern he found was the product of a real consistency in what witnesses had seen, or the product of a selection methodology that emphasized certain accounts and minimized others, remained a genuinely open question in the literature, one that later researchers would engage with formally and in detail. The book sits in the record as Mokele left it, the testimonies compiled, the methodology documented, the conclusion held open rather than forced, the behavioral detail that the creature was known to overturn canoes, carried within the oral tradition of the region, a practical quality, a knowledge useful to people who use the river for work and travel, transmitted between generations, not as entertainment, but as information about a real navigational hazard. A fisherman whose grandfather told him which pools along the Likouala's herb to approach with caution, and why, carries that knowledge the way he carries the knowledge of which sections of river run shallow in the dry season. It is environmental knowledge, specific and functional, not distinguishable in its transmission from any other piece of practical understanding about a landscape. The researchers who documented it treated it accordingly as testimony about the environment from people who had long experience of that environment, without needing to decide in advance whether the hazard described was a known animal or an unknown one. There is a quality to the small head described in multiple accounts that is worth sitting with for a moment. Among the animals of the Likouala swamp system, crocodiles, monitor lizards, elephants, hippopotami, head-to-body proportions vary considerably, but in each case the head is either consistent with the body size or considerably larger. What the witnesses described in the Mokele-mbembe accounts was a head distinctly small relative to the neck and body below it, a feature that, if accurate, places the described animal outside the expected morphology of every large species known to inhabit the region. A small oval head at the top of a long flexible neck attached to a hippopotamus-sized body is a configuration that does not correspond to any animal currently documented in Central Africa, and the specificity with which multiple independent witnesses described this proportion, without apparent coaching, in accounts gathered across different years and different settlements, is what kept the testimony record from being easily collapsed into misidentification of a known species. Agnagna stood at the edge of Lake Tella on the 23rd of April, 1983, and held his camera. The neck he described was 1 to 1.5 meters above the waterline. The head at the top of it was small and oval. The back visible above the dark water was wide and dark gray. The animal was at approximately 300 meters distance, close enough that the dimensions could be estimated with some confidence, far enough that the macro setting on the camera rendered the footage useless. For approximately 20 minutes, by his estimate, the animal remained at the surface. The lake held it the way Lake Tella holds everything, the forest canopy, enclosing the water at every edge, the surface dark and flat, no road in or out, no communication with the outside world available from its banks. Whatever was at the surface of the lake that morning in April was at the surface in a place as removed from documentation infrastructure as any inhabited landscape on the continent. The camera was wrong. The animal was there. Those are the facts as Agnagna recorded them, and the gap between them is exactly the gap the testimony record consistently inhabits, something described with precision, something not captured in a form that resolves the question it raises. The duration of Agnagna's reported observation, approximately 20 minutes, is itself a detail that the compiled testimony record illuminates from an unexpected direction. The indigenous accounts gathered by Mokele and his colleagues did not describe the creature as something glimpsed briefly and gone. Multiple accounts described encounters in which the animal was visible for an extended period, long enough for behavioral details to be noted, long enough to observe the way it held itself in the water, the angle of the neck, the movement or stillness of the head, an animal that remained at the surface of deep water for extended periods. In the behavioral picture, the testimony assembled was not a creature that surfaced only briefly and dove again. It occupied the water surface in a way that allowed sustained observation by people who had time to look. That behavioral consistency between the indigenous accounts and Agnagna's formal report is one of the details that researchers who examined the testimony record found most difficult to explain away as coincidence or coordination. The herbivorous characterization of the creature, consistent across the independent accounts compiled by McCall, placed it in a specific ecological position within the swamp system. An animal of hippopotamus size or larger, moving through flooded forest margins and deep river pools, eating plants rather than fish or flesh, would occupy a feeding niche that no currently documented large animal in the Likouala region fills in quite the way described. Hippopotami eat grass and aquatic vegetation, but their range in the Likouala region is documented and their morphology well known. What the testimony described, an animal that specifically ate the fruit of the Moabi tree, among other plant matter, that occupied deep pools and lake environments, that was large enough to overturn a dugout canoe without apparent effort, would, if real, occupy a place in the local ecosystem that the currently mapped fauna does not fill. The consistency of the testimony across decades and across the geographic spread of the Likouala witness base is not by itself evidence that what was described is real. Consistent testimonies can reflect the spread of a detailed oral tradition through a community rather than multiple independent encounters with a physical animal. Mokele was aware of this possibility and noted it in his compilation, distinguishing between accounts from witnesses who claimed direct personal observation and accounts that appeared to reflect transmitted tradition rather than first-hand experience. The number of accounts that met his criteria for claimed direct observation was smaller than the total body of testimony he gathered, and within that smaller set, the consistency he noted is the consistency that the evidentiary record rests on. Whether it is sufficient is a question the record leaves open with the same quiet persistence that characterizes everything else the testimony assembled. There is a moment in the fisherman's account, the one near the Bai River confluence, speaking with Mokele in 1980, where the hands that shaped the air to show the neck and the small head above it stilled, and the fisherman simply looked at the researcher across the surface where the illustrations lay. The gesture had said what words could not quite say. The neck rose, the head was small, the animal was present in the water in a way that the available animal illustrations could not accommodate. That stillness after the gesture, the moment when the description has been given and the giving of it is complete, is the moment the testimony record inhabits most fully. Not the selection of the illustration, not the verbal description, but the moment after, when what was seen has been offered in the best language available, and the question of whether it has been understood sits quietly between the person who spoke and the person who listened. The compiled testimony, the reddish-brown skin, the smooth surface, the long flexible neck, the small oval head, the column-like legs, the herbivorous diet, the territorial aggression, the Moabi fruit floating on the dark water near the flooded forest margin, was assembled by Mokele with the intention of placing it in the evidentiary record in a form that could be examined. It was examined. It has continued to be examined. The details that hold most firmly under scrutiny are the specific ones, the color named consistently, the head described as small relative to the neck across independent accounts, the food item named botanically rather than generically, the behavioral pattern attributed not to predation but to territory. The details that remain most complicated are the methodological ones, how the testimony was gathered, what was selected for inclusion, what the illustration comparison process may or may not have shaped. Both of these dimensions of the record are real. Both sit in the compiled account with equal weight, the specific details and their complications together, the way any genuine evidentiary record holds the strength and the limitation of what was found. The Moabi fruit drops from the canopy into the swamp water at the edge of the flooded forest. It is round and heavy, the way the fruit of that tree is, and it hits the dark surface and floats for a while before it begins to sink. Multiple independent witnesses, speaking to researchers in different years at different points across the Likouala region, named it as food, not vegetation broadly, this tree, this fruit. The particularity of the detail is the kind of thing that stays in the record long after the larger questions have moved on, drifting on the surface of dark swamp water, the way the fruit itself drifts, specific and unresolved, named carefully by people who had good reason to watch the water long enough to know what fed from it. Still there in the testimony where it was placed, still floating, still waiting for something larger than itself to surface beneath it, or to leave it to drift on undisturbed. Somewhere in the rock record, in exposed geological strata on several continents, there is a line. It is not a dramatic feature. It is a pale band of clay, usually only a few centimeters thick, pressed between layers of older stone below and younger stone above. Geologists call it the KPG boundary, the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, and it marks a moment approximately 66 million years ago when something changed in the composition of the world so profoundly and so rapidly that the change left a physical seam in the ground. Below that line, in the older stone, the fossil record contains sauropod dinosaurs. Above it, in the younger stone, it does not. This is not a matter of incomplete survey or insufficient excavation. Paleontologists have worked every continent for more than 2 centuries, have cataloged tens of thousands of individual specimens, have examined strata from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and the pattern holds without exception. Above that pale band of clay, no sauropod bone has ever been found. The line is in the ground. It has been in the ground for 66 million years. It is the first thing that the Mokele-mbembe question runs against. The question it runs against is not a small one. The fossil record of sauropod dinosaurs is among the most thoroughly documented in vertebrate paleontology. These were animals that existed across the Mesozoic era for over 140 million years, spread across land masses that were then configured very differently than they are now, leaving bone beds and trackways on every major continent. Their remains are abundant enough that paleontologists have been able to study not just their anatomy, but their growth rates, their social behavior, their posture, their likely locomotion, and the probable mechanics of their respiratory systems. They are not obscure animals. They are among the most extensively studied organisms in the history of life on Earth, and the evidence for their survival past the KPG boundary is at present non-existent, not sparse, not ambiguous, but simply absent from a record, extensive enough that absence carries real meaning. The sauropod hypothesis for Mokele-mbembe was never the position of mainstream paleontology. It was the position of a small number of cryptozoologists, most prominently Roy McCall, who held that the consistency of indigenous witness descriptions and the remoteness of the Likouala region made the hypothesis worth pursuing as a serious scientific question. McCall was a biochemist by training, not a paleontologist, and his argument rested primarily on the testimony record he compiled across 2 expeditions and on the geographic argument that the Congo Basin's sheer inaccessibility might have permitted a relict population to persist undetected. These were not frivolous arguments. Macau was a credentialed scientist at a major research university, and the effort he brought to the question was genuine and documented. The KPG boundary was not something he was unaware of. He acknowledged it directly in his 1987 book. What he argued was that the absence of fossil evidence above the boundary was not the same as absence of living animals, that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence in a region as poorly surveyed as the Likouala swamp. This is a formally valid logical point. It is also, in the assessment of the mainstream scientific community, insufficient to override what the fossil record consistently shows. Vertebrate paleontologist Darren Naish, in his 2016 book Hunting Monsters, Cryptozoology, and the Reality Behind the Myths, addressed the Mokele-mbembe evidence in detail and framed the paleontological objection in terms that go beyond simply pointing to the KPG boundary. Naish noted that sauropod survival into the modern period would require not just the absence of their fossils in post-Cretaceous strata, it would require a 66 million year gap in the fossil record of a large, heavily built, slow reproducing terrestrial animal. Gaps of that kind do not occur for large vertebrates with hard skeletal tissue in regions that have been geologically active and have produced sedimentary deposits. The Congo Basin is not a geologically inert region. It has produced Miocene-era primate fossils and other large vertebrate remains. The sauropod population persisting into the modern era in that region would be expected to leave some trace across those millions of years of sediment. None has been found. This is the argument that the fossil record makes, and it is the argument that the sauropod hypothesis has not answered. Then there is the question of posture. The descriptions given by witnesses at Lake Tella and along the Likouala tributaries consistently place the animal's neck above the waterline in an upright, vertically elevated position, the neck held high, the small head at its apex, the animal visible from the chest up while the body remains submerged. This posture, an image that recurs across decades of testimony, is one that current biomechanical research on sauropod locomotion does not support as their resting or habitual stance. Studies of sauropod vertebral morphology and musculature, reviewed in the paleontological literature and addressed specifically by Naish in his 2016 analysis, suggest that sauropods most likely carried their necks in a roughly horizontal position, extended forward and low, in a manner consistent with the mechanical constraints of their neck bones and the muscle attachments that can be inferred from them. The swan-like, vertically elevated neck posture that figures most prominently in popular depictions of sauropods, and that corresponds most closely to what Mokele-mbembe witnesses described, is the posture that biomechanical analysis has made progressively harder to defend as typical behavior. This is a complication the sauropod hypothesis carries quietly. The described animal looks like a sauropod as people imagine sauropods. It looks less like a sauropod as scientists now understand them to have moved. The ecological argument is the one that requires the largest frame to hold. A breeding population of sauropod-sized animals, animals whose body mass is estimated in the tens of thousands of kilograms for large individuals, would require, in order to be genetically viable, many dozens of individuals at minimum and more plausibly several hundred. Each individual eating the several hundred kilograms of plant matter per day that a large herbivore of that mass would require, would together constitute a grazing pressure on the Likouala swamp vegetation that would be detectable at scale. The total vegetation consumption of a viable breeding population would represent an impact on the swamp's plant communities equivalent to a large cattle operation operating continuously. Ecologists assessing this argument have noted that the Likouala swamp, while genuinely vast and genuinely difficult to survey at ground level, has been examined from the air and by satellite. Its vegetation patterns have been mapped. The kind of large-scale, persistent vegetation disturbance that a breeding sauropod population would produce, cleared feeding areas, paths through swamp forest, large-scale trampling of riverine vegetation, has not appeared in any aerial or satellite survey of the region. The swamp continues to look, from above, like an intact and undisturbed rainforest wetland system. This does not prove that nothing large lives in it. It does make the sauropod hypothesis significantly harder to sustain at the scale a breeding population would require. There is also the matter of what the expeditions actually found, held against what they hoped to find. James Powell and Roy McCall reached the Likouala region in 1980 with a structured methodology and returned with a testimony record. The testimony record is real. The physical evidence, a photograph, a footprint cast, a filmed image, is either absent, ambiguous, or capable of multiple interpretations. Herman Regusters reached Lake Tella in 1981 and returned with photographs that could not be analyzed definitively and audio recordings whose origin could not be established. Marcelin Agnagna observed something at Lake Tella in April 1983 for an estimated 20 minutes and returned without usable film footage because of a camera setting error. The Nippon Television Expedition in 1992 captured aerial footage of a large dark shape moving across the lake surface with a V-shaped wake, footage that mainstream zoologists have since interpreted as most consistent with swimming African forest elephants, a behavior that has been photographically documented in the region. Each of these outcomes considered individually is ambiguous. Considered together across more than a decade of dedicated effort, they form a pattern in which the physical evidence never quite arrives and the claimed encounters remain, in the evidentiary record, unverifiable. This is the shape the investigation has. Darren Naish's 2016 analysis raises a methodological concern about the testimony record itself that deserves to be held with some care. His argument is not that the witnesses were lying or that their experiences were not genuine. His argument is that the way the testimony was collected and compiled introduced systematic bias that is difficult to correct for. The illustration comparison methodology used by Powell and McCall, showing witnesses printed images of living and extinct animals and recording which image they selected as closest to what they had seen, has been questioned on the grounds that the selection of images, the order of presentation, and the social dynamics of the interview situation may have shaped the responses in ways that inflated apparent agreement. Witnesses who pointed to sauropod illustrations may have done so partly because the sauropod illustration most closely matched the researchers' evident interest. Accounts that did not fit the sauropod template, descriptions that were vaguer, or that described something more reptilian and less massive, or that described behavior inconsistent with a large herbivore, may have received less weight in McCall's published compilation than the accounts that supported his hypothesis. Naish's critique is that the consistency McCall found in the testimony record may be partly a property of McCall's compilation methodology, rather than purely a property of the original witnesses. This critique has not been formally answered in the cryptozoological literature. It remains in the published record as an open question about how the evidence was assembled. The alternative explanations that have been proposed for Mokele-mbembe sightings occupy a different register than the sauropod hypothesis, and they are worth sitting with for a moment because they are, in several important respects, more plausible from a purely biological standpoint, while still representing a genuinely significant possibility. The Nile crocodile explanation accounts for a great deal. Nile crocodiles in the Congo Basin have been documented at lengths exceeding 5 meters, and a large crocodile seen in poor light, at distance from a low-sitting dugout canoe, with part of its body submerged and part elevated above the waterline, could produce an impression of size, elongation, and partial neck elevation that might read very differently from the clear identification a close-range encounter in good light would allow. This is not a dismissal of what witnesses describe. It is an observation that the conditions under which most Likouala River encounters occurred, dusk or early morning, poor visibility, moving water, the witness sitting low, and the animal at the water surface, are precisely the conditions that make even experienced observers uncertain about what they are seeing. The African forest elephant explanation is less immediately obvious, but carries real weight, particularly in connection with the 1992 Nippon television aerial footage. African forest elephants are smaller than their savanna relatives, but still represent the largest land animals in the Congo Basin, and their behavior in and around water includes lake crossings that, filmed from the air, produce exactly the kind of elongated dark shape moving steadily through open water with a clean V-shaped wake that the Nippon footage shows. Elephants swimming with the trunk raised above the water surface create a silhouette that, from altitude and at the resolution of 1992 aerial film equipment, is not easily distinguished from a long-necked animal of comparable overall length. The mainstream zoological interpretation of the Nippon footage as swimming elephants is not a dismissal of the footage. The footage is real, the shape is real, the wake is real. It is an interpretation of what produced those things, and it is an interpretation that requires no new zoological category and no revision of the fossil record. There is a third alternative that sits somewhere between the large known animals and the sauropod hypothesis, and it is the one that some researchers have found most interesting to hold: the possibility of an unknown giant monitor lizard. Monitor lizards are documented in the Congo Basin, and their behavior, semi-aquatic, capable of raising the head and neck above the water surface when alert or territorial, capable of moving rapidly through swamp vegetation, produces a physical profile that shares several characteristics with the Mokele-mbembe descriptions. A genuinely large unknown monitor species, one significantly exceeding the documented size of known African monitor lizards, would represent a major zoological discovery without requiring any modification of the fossil record or any revision of the basic understanding of when dinosaurs went extinct. This hypothesis has never been confirmed either. No specimen of an unknown giant monitor has been collected from the Congo Basin. No reliable physical trace of such an animal exists in the record. It remains a hypothesis, more biologically conservative than the sauropod idea, and less well supported by the testimony record's specific details, sitting in the space between what witnesses described and what science can currently account for. What is perhaps most honest to say about the Mokele-mbembe case, at this late point in the account of it, is that it is a case with several distinct layers that do not resolve in the same direction. The testimony record is real and extensively documented. Indigenous Likouala region communities have described a large water-dwelling animal for generations, and those descriptions carry a specificity, a particular skin color, a particular feeding behavior, a particular habitat preference, a particular interaction pattern with the Moabi tree, whose fruits float on swamp water, that distinguishes them from vague folklore and places them in the same category of attentive environmental observation that produces reliable field knowledge about large animals. That layer of the case is genuine and deserves the weight that careful attention to it has given it. The expedition record is also real. Multiple teams of credentialed researchers traveled to one of the most remote regions on Earth at considerable personal cost and difficulty, and their compiled findings consist of testimony, ambiguous photographs, a camera set to the wrong focal length, and one aerial film of a shape that most zoologists believe is an elephant. That layer of the case is also genuine, and what it shows is a sustained effort that produced no definitive physical evidence. The scientific objections, the fossil record, the biomechanics, the population ecology are serious, well-grounded, and have not been answered by the evidence the expeditions returned with. That layer is also genuine. Holding all three layers at once without collapsing any of them into the others is what the case actually requires. It is not a case in which indigenous testimony was wrong. The oral tradition describes something real and specifically observed, whatever that something is. It is not a case in which the expeditions found nothing. They found a consistent testimony record across independent witnesses and gathered an extensive account of a phenomenon that the Likouala communities have maintained for generations. It is not a case in which science has settled the question. The objections are serious, and the physical evidence is absent, but the honest formulation is that the question remains open rather than that it has been closed. What the case shows, held in this way, is a phenomenon that is real at one level of analysis, the level of documented human knowledge and reported experience, and unresolved at another, which is the level of physical evidence and biological plausibility. The Likouala swamp is still there. It still covers its estimated 55,000 square kilometers of flooded forest and open marshland in northern Republic of Congo. Its slow rivers still drain into Lake Tele through channels too narrow for anything larger than a dugout canoe, and Lake Tele still sits in its roughly circular clearing of dark water, entirely enclosed by forest, its surface reachable only by several days of paddling from the village of Boha, with no road in and no road out. The swamp has not changed significantly since the expeditions of the early 1980s. The tree canopy is still there. The deep river pools are still there. The Moebi trees at the flooded forest margins are still fruiting in their seasons, dropping their heavy round fruits into dark water where they float for a while before they sink. Whatever was described by Congolese fishermen, Boha pygmy hunters, Marcel and Agnanya on the shore of the lake in April 1983, and the generation of indigenous witnesses before all of them is still, at this point in the record, undetermined. The case has not closed because the evidence has not been found that would close it in either direction. Darren Naish's 2016 book, Hunting Monsters, is still in print. Its Mokele-mbembe chapter is still readable in libraries and in online archives, its pages carrying Makel's original witness testimony summaries, alongside Naish's careful analytical notes questioning the methodology by which that testimony was collected and weighted. The book does not resolve the question. It sharpens the terms on which the question rests, and it places those terms in the published scientific record in a form that can be engaged with. That engagement has not happened, at least not in the form of a published rebuttal that has satisfied the broader scientific community. The case file is still open in the specific sense that the objections remain unanswered, and the physical evidence that would answer them has not been produced. This is simply the condition of the Mokele-mbembe question. It has been in this condition for decades. It may remain in it for decades more. There is something worth sitting with in the specific texture of the geological objection. The KPG boundary, that pale band of clay in exposed rock strata on several continents, marking 66 million years, in a form that can be pointed to and held and placed in a drawer. Below the line, sauropods. Above it, none. The line does not argue, it does not speculate, it simply holds in the stone what the stone recorded, and what the stone recorded is a discontinuity so complete that 2 centuries of vertebrate paleontology on every landmass on Earth have not found a single exception. The Moabi fruit floats on the swamp water, the clay band holds in the rock. Both of these things are true at the same time, in the same world, and they do not resolve each other. The fruit floats, and the boundary holds, and Lake Tella sits in its circle of unbroken forest, receiving whatever season comes to it. The animal Darren Naish's analysis is most skeptical about, and the animal the Boha communities have described for generations are not necessarily, from the standpoint of the open record, the same animal. Naish is skeptical of the sauropod hypothesis. The sauropod hypothesis was proposed by Western researchers. The indigenous testimony predates the sauropod hypothesis and does not depend on it. What Likouala fishermen and Boha hunters described is a large animal that lives in deep river pools and in Lake Tella that overturns dugout canoes in territorial encounters, that eats Moabi fruits, that has smooth reddish-brown skin and a long flexible neck and a small head and large column-like legs, and that submerges quietly and is rarely seen clearly and inhabits water too deep and too dark for easy observation. Whether that animal is a surviving sauropod, a misidentified known species, an unknown giant monitor, or something else entirely that has not yet been categorized. The testimony describes something, and the testimony has been described carefully enough and consistently enough across independent witnesses over enough decades that its existence as a body of careful environmental observation is not in question. What it describes is in question. It has been in question for a long time. Roy McCall died in 2013. He did not find Mokele-mbembe in the Likouala swamp, and he did not find evidence sufficient to settle the question in either direction. The expeditions he organized and participated in are in the record, with their findings and their limitations exactly as they were. James Powell, who traveled with him in 1980, produced interview documentation that still forms part of the primary source record for the case. Marcelin Agnagna, who saw something at Lake Tella on a morning in April 1983 while holding a camera set to macro focus, filed a formal written account that remains in the documentation. The Nippon television footage from 1992 is preserved and has been analyzed by mainstream zoologists who have given it their best available interpretation. All of this material exists. None of it resolves into a clear picture of what lives or does not live in the deep pools of the Likouala swamp. The record is complete in the sense that it contains everything that was found. It is incomplete in the sense that what it found is insufficient to close the question. The slow rhythm of what is known and what is not known in this case has a particular quality, not the quality of a mystery that will be solved with the next expedition, or the next photograph, or the next careful analysis of aerial footage, but the quality of something that has settled into its own shape over decades and is content to remain in that shape unhurried. The testimony continues. The swamp continues. The Moabi trees fruit along the flooded forest margins and drop their fruit into black water, and the water holds the fruit for a while, slowly, in whatever season the rain has produced. The record does not demand resolution. It holds what was reported, what was found, what was not found, and what the stone contains, and it leaves those things in the same archive together, where they have been for 40 years, waiting for the kind of evidence that would move any of them from one column to another. Naish's book sits in the library with its annotations. The KPG boundary sits in the rock face with its clay. The 1983 account of a reddish-brown neck above Lake Tella sits in the written record with its camera error noted.